and Goblin Reddit. Today's story is...
My wife destroyed my relationship with my children with one lie that lasted for years. Until my son called me unexpectedly and discovered the shocking family truth. I'd always believed that my marriage was solid. Of course, we faced difficulties like any couple, but I really thought we could overcome any obstacle together. Until that fateful day came that changed everything. I received several text messages late at night from a mutual acquaintance who had seen my wife holding hands with another friend, confirming what I had long refused to suspect. My wife had been unfaithful, and not just once. It was not simply a momentary lapse, but a constant pattern of betrayal that shattered the foundations of our relationship. Confronting her was one of the most painful experiences I have ever had to endure. When I presented her with the evidence, she did not try to deny it. Instead, she adopted a defensive stance, arguing that my busy work schedule had pushed her to seek solace in the arms of another person. It was a twisted attempt to transfer the blame to me, but I didn't fall for it. I told her that our marriage could not survive such a betrayal and, despite the pain I felt, I filed for divorce. The legal proceedings were truly appalling. She fought tooth and nail for custody of our children, claiming that I was too emotionally detached to be a good father. Her words hurt me deeply. I had always tried to be there for my family, both emotionally and financially. However, in the end, the judge granted her primary custody, leaving me with only visiting rights. It felt like an additional punishment on an already broken heart. After the divorce was final, I made a firm decision to remain present in my children's lives, although I knew it wouldn't be easy. At first, our relationship was cordial. We organized visitation schedules and I tried to make the most of every moment I spent with them. I wanted to assure them that they weren't losing their father, even though our family dynamic had changed irrevocably. However, it wasn't long before cracks began to appear in our relationship. Subtle comments began to seep through during my children's visits. They would ask me things like why I didn't want to be with them anymore, or why I had abandoned them to start another family. At first, these questions baffled me. I had never abandoned them. And I definitely didn't have another family. As these comments became more direct, I began to understand the narrative that their mother was instilling in them. I had been portrayed as the villain of the story, as a father who had fled from his responsibilities because he couldn't bear the pressure. According to her, I had chosen my freedom over my children, leaving her to pick up the pieces. It was completely untrue, but how could I expect young children to question the words of the parent they spent most of their time with? They were still too young to be told about the infidelity and everything that had happened after. The manipulation was not always obvious. Sometimes it was subtle, with seemingly casual comments about how difficult life was as a single mother or how I had to do everything without help. Other times it was more direct. My daughter once told me that she knew I didn't love them as much because I never fought harder to stay. Those words cut me to the quick. I tried to explain that I hadn't left by choice, but her mother's version of events had already taken deep root in their minds. Meanwhile, I worked hard to rebuild my life. I rented a modest house near them so that I could be present, and I made sure that our weekends together were full of fun and quality time. But no matter how much effort I put in, I always felt like I was swimming against the current in a fast-flowing river. My ex-wife, on the other hand, seemed determined to make my life increasingly complicated. She would accidentally forget to bring the children on time or schedule activities during my visiting hours, claiming it was for their own good. If I dared to protest, she accused me of being selfish and of not putting the children's needs first. It was a constant battle in which I always ended up losing ground. As time went by, the emotional strain began to take its toll. My children, who had previously been warm and affectionate towards me, began to distance themselves. They stopped calling me Dad and started using my first name, something that their mother actively encouraged. They would roll their eyes during our conversations or simply refuse to share any details about their lives. It was as if I was slowly losing them and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to communicate with my ex to address the problem, but each conversation ended the same way, with her claiming that I was imagining things and needed to accept the consequences of my own actions. It was incredibly frustrating, but I refused to stoop to her level. I held out hope that, as my children grew older, they would see through the lies and form their own independent opinions. The final blow came when I found out through a mutual friend that my ex had been spreading rumors about me in her social circle. She told several people that I had abandoned her and the children for a younger woman, a complete fabrication. I wasn't seriously dating anyone at the time, but the damage was already done. My reputation was tarnished and I felt powerless to defend myself. Even so, I absolutely refused to give up. I continued to show up for my children even when they made it clear that they didn't want me around. I thought that if I remained a constant in their lives, they would eventually recognize the truth, but deep down I knew that the more time that passed, the more difficult it would be to undo the damage caused. The distance between my children and me grew wider as the years went by. I watched them from afar, longing for the days when they would run into my arms after a long day at work. Now they barely looked at me, much less acknowledged my efforts to be there for them. It was a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I couldn't give up hope that one day, when they were old enough, I would tell them the whole truth about what happened. Update 1. The change in my relationship with my children happened surprisingly suddenly. After years of feeling like a stranger to them, I had resigned myself to those cold and distant exchanges during our visits. I always hoped that something would change, but I tried not to get my hopes up too much to avoid disappointment. One day, my son Carl called me unexpectedly, and seeing his name on my phone screen was such a big surprise that for a moment I thought it was a mistake. When I answered, his voice sounded calm, almost hesitant. He asked me if I could pick him up from school. He didn't give me much of an explanation, and I decided not to push him. I simply told him I'd be there in 20 minutes. The drive there felt like a dream, filled with a mixture of nervousness and cautious optimism. Was it just a logistical problem, or was there something deeper behind his call? When I arrived, I found Carl sitting alone on the school steps, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. He looked small and vulnerable, as if something were weighing him down. I called his name softly and he got up without saying a word, climbing into the passenger seat. The return journey was silent. I asked him if he wanted to talk about what was bothering him, but he shook his head and said he just wanted to go home, to my house, not to his mother's. That puzzled me, considering how eager he usually was to leave when our time together was normally over. When we arrived at my apartment, I offered him something to eat and we sat down in the living room. He finally broke the silence, asking me directly why I had left him and his sister. I had prepared myself mentally for such a question for years, but hearing it from his lips still hurt deeply. I calmly explained to him that I had never abandoned them, that I had fought intensely to remain in their lives. Carl did not seem convinced by my words. He told me that his mother had told them that I had abandoned the family because I did not want to take responsibility. The anger that I had been holding back for years threatened to overflow, but I managed to keep it under control. I told him that it was not true and that it was time for him to hear the whole story. I explained that the divorce wasn't because I stopped loving him or his sister. I told him about his mother's infidelity, how she had betrayed me and left me with no alternative but to end the marriage. I didn't sugarcoat the truth, but I didn't try to demonize her completely either. I explained that people make mistakes and that sometimes those mistakes hurt the people they love the most. Carl remained silent for a long time, processing everything I had just revealed to him. I could see the conflict reflected in his eyes. It was not easy for him to reconcile the version of events that his mother had instilled in him for years with the truth that I was now sharing with him. In the following weeks, Carl began to spend more time with me. He didn't tell his mother about our conversations, and neither did I mention it. I wasn't looking to provoke a confrontation. I just wanted to rebuild the relationship with my son. Little by little he opened up, asking more questions about the past. One night at dinner, he asked me why his mother had lied to them about what had happened. I replied that I couldn't be completely sure of her motives. Perhaps she felt ashamed of her actions or didn't know how to explain them properly. Or maybe she had convinced herself that her version of events was the truth. Carl's questions made me wonder if Sia, my daughter, was also starting to connect the dots on her own. She was more reserved than Carl during our visits, but I noticed that she paid more attention to me than before. She didn't ask me directly, but I could sense her growing curiosity. A real turning point came during a family gathering on my ex-wife's side. Although I wasn't there, I found out what happened afterwards. Apparently, one of her relatives made a derogatory comment about me, describing me as an irresponsible father. To the surprise of everyone present, Carl intervened immediately. He told them that they didn't know the whole story and that they shouldn't judge so hastily. That moment marked a significant change. Carl was no longer just internally questioning his mother's narrative. Now he was publicly defending me. It was a bittersweet experience, knowing that my son had to defend me in a room full of people who considered me the villain of the story. A few weeks later, Carl confronted his mother directly. He told me later that she reacted defensively and angrily, accusing me of poisoning his mind against her, but Carl stood his ground. He told her about the conversations we had had and asked her directly why she had lied about the reasons for the divorce. Her overreaction only reinforced Carl's determination to get honest answers, and when she failed to provide him with a clear and convincing explanation, he began to see her in a new light. It wasn't that he stopped loving her, but the blind trust he had placed in her words gradually began to fade. Sia also started to ask more questions. She wasn't as direct as Carl, but I could tell she was thinking about everything I had revealed to them. During one of our visits, she asked me if I had ever wanted to really leave them. I answered her the same way I had answered Carl. I never wanted to leave them, and I'd always tried to be there for them at every important moment in their lives. It wasn't easy to see them process the truth. They were caught between loyalty to their mother and the realization that she hadn't been honest with them all these years. I tried to assure them that it was okay to continue loving both parents, even if one of us had made serious mistakes. However, the more the children found out, the more strained their relationship with their mother became. They started spending more time at my house, not out of obligation but because they genuinely wanted to. For the first time in many years, I felt like I was really their father again. What I hadn't anticipated was how this change would affect my ex-wife. Her family, who had always been unconditionally on her side, also began to question her version of events. The truth has a way of making its way through even when someone tries to suppress it with all their might. Update 2. Carl and Sia's decision to spend more time with me didn't just impact my ex-wife. It also had an unexpected effect on her entire family support system. But at that moment, my attention was completely focused on my children, not on her. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't long before she noticed the children's growing distance, and she definitely didn't take it well. It started with small details. She started calling the children more frequently when they were with me. Her voice was loud enough over the telephone speaker for me to perceive the tension in her tone. She constantly reminded them about plans or responsibilities, subtly drawing them back into her sphere of influence. I did not interfere in these communications, but I could clearly see that this situation was confusing for them. One Friday night, Carl confessed to me that he didn't feel like going back to his mother's house yet. He explained that the atmosphere there was very tense, that she had been irritable and distant since he confronted her about the infidelity. Sia nodded in agreement, adding that her mother seemed constantly upset, although she never explained the reason for her discomfort. I assured them that they didn't have to make any hasty decisions. Carl was about to turn 18 and Sia was 16. Legally, their mother couldn't stop them from spending more time at my house or staying there more often if they wanted to. However, I couldn't ignore the feeling of unease that was forming in my stomach. I knew my ex-wife well, and I knew she wasn't the kind of person who easily gave up control of any situation. Sure enough, she soon started sending me messages. At first they were relatively polite, asking me why the children had been spending so much time with me lately. I replied calmly, explaining that it was a decision they had made for themselves and that I was not pressuring them to stay, but her messages quickly took on an accusatory tone. She accused me directly of manipulating the children, of deliberately turning them against her. She claimed that I was filling their minds with lies to make her look bad in their eyes. I tried to reason with her, reminding her that the children deserved to know the truth about what had happened. This only seemed to intensify her anger towards me. One night she called me directly. Her voice sounded sharp, mixed with obvious notes of frustration and despair. She complained that I had no right to tell the children about her infidelity, that it was a private matter between us and did not concern them. I replied that they were old enough to understand what had really happened and that they deserved honesty from both of us. She did not take my words well. She accused me of destroying her relationship with the children, of dismantling the bonds of her family. I could feel the emotion in her trembling voice, but I stood firm in my position. I told her clearly that if she wanted to repair her relationship with our children, she would have to start by taking responsibility for her own past actions. Our conversation ended abruptly with her hanging up the phone, and I knew immediately that this conflict was far from resolved. Over the next week, I began to hear comments and rumors passed on by mutual friends and some family members. She was telling anyone who would listen that I was mentally manipulating the children, feeding them falsehoods to turn them against her. The situation was emotionally exhausting. As the days went by, the tension between the children and their mother visibly increased. Carl began to avoid her phone calls and Sia became increasingly reserved and silent. I was told that their mother had been acting erratically, going from showing exaggerated affection to expressing intense anger in a matter of minutes. The climax came during a weekend the children were spending with me. Carl confessed that his mother had shown him a letter I had written years before, during the divorce proceedings. She had used it as supposed proof that I didn't really care about my children, selecting specific phrases out of context to fit her destructive narrative. Carl was clearly upset, but it wasn't so much anger as pain. He asked me why his mother would resort to such a strategy, why she couldn't just talk to him honestly instead of trying to manipulate him like that. I didn't have a simple answer to offer him. All I could do was remind him that no matter how hard someone tries to distort it, the truth always comes out eventually. Sia also began to ask deeper questions. She wanted to know if her mother had always behaved in this way. She even asked me if I had noticed any warning signs during our marriage that I had overlooked at the time. It was difficult to navigate these conversations without allowing my own accumulated bitterness to affect my responses. I explained that people can change over time, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. and that the really important thing now was to focus on the present and on building healthy relationships. As the children grew increasingly distant from their mother, her behavior became progressively more erratic and unpredictable. She began turning up at my house unannounced, demanding to speak to the children immediately. I never allowed her in, but these confrontations were emotionally draining for everyone. One day she accused me outright of trying to take the children away from her completely. I assured her that this was not true, that all I wanted was for them to have a balanced and healthy relationship with both parents. She didn't believe me. The situation reached a critical point when Carl flatly refused to return to his mother's house. He explained to me that he no longer felt safe there, that he had completely lost confidence in her. Sia shared similar feelings. I didn't force them to go. I told them they had every right to make their own decisions, and that their feelings were completely valid. However, I also understood that this situation was not sustainable in the long term. Something would have to change eventually. In the midst of all this chaos, I found myself having to explain the complex situation to various members of the family who were starting to take sides in the conflict. My parents offered me their unconditional support, but they were deeply concerned about the emotional impact that the whole situation was having on the children. My ex-wife's family, on the other hand, were starting to detect inconsistencies in her version of events. Her sister, who had always been fiercely loyal to her, called me unexpectedly one night. She confessed that she no longer knew what to think about the whole situation, that the children's behavior did not at all coincide with the story her sister had been telling for years. She asked me to tell her my version of the truth and, for the first time, I felt that someone on her side of the family was really willing to listen without prejudice. So I told her absolutely everything that had happened. I could hear the disbelief in her voice as we spoke. She told me that she had no idea that the situation had been so serious and that she felt ashamed for having blindly believed her sister without questioning anything for so long. The truth was finally starting to reach the really important people, and I could only hope that it would bring some clarity and peace amidst so much emotional chaos. Through all these difficulties, my main priority was still Carl and Sia. Their world had been completely turned upside down, and I was deeply concerned for their emotional well-being. As the situation continued to unfold with my ex-wife, I knew it was only a matter of time before her family became more directly involved. While her sister had shown signs of understanding the truth, her father represented a completely different challenge. My ex-father-in-law Charles had always been a proud and intimidating man, quick to judge and fiercely protective of the family reputation. He had been one of the most forceful voices supporting his daughter's claims and had never hesitated to portray me as the villain in this story. So when Charles unexpectedly showed up at my door on a Saturday afternoon, I wasn't completely surprised. Carl and Sia had gone out with friends, so I was home alone when I opened the door and saw him standing there, arms crossed over his chest and a deep frown on his face. Charles wasted no time in unnecessary pleasantries. He launched straight into his accusations, claiming that I had manipulated his grandchildren and was destroying his daughter's life. He claimed that I was turning the whole family against her and that I was doing it out of pure revenge after the divorce. I invited him in, not because I really wanted to, but because I thought it was preferable to have this conversation in private rather than in full view of all the neighbors. Once inside, his stance became even more rigid, making it clear that he had not come to talk, but to lecture me. He began to talk at length about family loyalty, about how families should stick together no matter what the circumstances. She claimed that my actions were emotionally destroying her daughter and, by extension, affecting her whole family. I let her vent for a while, watching her face gradually redden with each word she uttered. When she finally paused, I calmly told her that I understood her frustration, but clearly there were aspects of the situation that she was unaware of or chose to ignore. That comment only seemed to fuel his indignation. He argued that I had no right to judge his daughter, that I had abandoned both her and the children, and now I was trying to rewrite history to look better. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure, and decided it was time to clarify the situation once and for all. I told Charles firmly that I had not abandoned anyone at all, least of all my own children. I explained that it was his daughter who decided to have an extramarital affair, not me. That statement made him stop momentarily, although he quickly regained his defensive stance, claiming that my accusations were baseless and lacked concrete evidence. It was then that I decided to reveal the whole truth. I explained that I knew exactly who his daughter's lover was, and that it wasn't just any stranger, but someone who had been very close to his family. Someone in whom everyone placed their trust. I saw the confusion briefly reflected on his face before I said the name Matthew. Charles's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face visibly paled and his mouth opened slightly, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. Matthew was his son's best friend, practically considered part of his family. The idea that his daughter had had a secret relationship with him clearly shocked him deeply. I explained that although I had no concrete physical evidence, Matthew had practically confessed to me during a confrontation years ago. As I mentioned before, the divorce was tremendously complicated. I still vividly remember the smug expression on his face when he told me that I was not enough to satisfy my wife, that she deserved someone who could really make her happy. Charles initially tried to dismiss my words, calling them mere speculation, but I could see doubt beginning to creep into his expression. I suggested that he ask his daughter directly if she didn't believe what I was telling him. Although I warned him that he probably wouldn't like the answer he would receive, she remained silent for several moments, her fists clenched at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded lower, almost trembling. She asked me why I hadn't revealed this information before, why I hadn't brought it up during the divorce proceedings. I explained that at the time, my main concern had been to protect Carl and Sia. I didn't want to expose them to a family scandal, and I certainly didn't want them to develop an extremely negative image of their mother. But now circumstances had changed radically. She was using the children as pawns in her personal game, and I wasn't prepared to stand by and allow that to continue. The children were old enough to know the truth about what had happened. Charles seemed to struggle with this new information. He muttered something about needing time to process it all and then turned to leave. However, before he walked out the door, he stopped and looked directly at me. He said that if what I had told him turned out to be true, it would change absolutely everything. A few days later, I learned from her sister that Charles had apparently confronted his daughter about Matthew and, although she did not flatly deny the accusations, her reaction had been extremely revealing. She had exploded furiously, accusing him of taking my side and trying to undermine her position. It wasn't long before the rest of the family gradually began to distance themselves. Her sister, who had already been skeptical, became more open about her doubts about my ex-wife's version of events. Even her mother, who had always been her staunchest supporter, seemed to be distancing herself from the situation. My ex-wife, as was to be expected, did not take these changes well. She intensified her accusations, claiming that I was trying to completely isolate her and ruin her life. But the more aggressively she reacted, the more people began to see through her behavior. The children were also picking up on the growing tension. Carl asked me one day if something had happened between his grandfather and his mother, and I explained to him simply that they were having a serious disagreement, but that it was not a burden that they should have to bear on their young shoulders. As the weeks passed, the consequences became increasingly evident. Matthew, who had been a constant presence at family gatherings, suddenly disappeared from the social scene. My ex-wife's family stopped inviting her to events as often as before. When they did, it was clear that their patience was rapidly running out. Update 3. After everything that had happened, the children clearly expressed their desire to stay with me for a long period of time. They didn't share many details about what happened when they were with their mother. However, the few situations they mentioned, frequent arguments, emotional manipulation, and the constant guilt she made them feel for supposedly abandoning her with me, made it clear that staying in that environment was not healthy for their emotional development. When Carl finally asked me if he and Sia could move in with me permanently, I didn't hesitate for a second to accept. I made it clear to them that they would always be free to visit their mother whenever they wanted, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in maintaining that contact for the time being. Their choice did not represent an outright rejection of their mother, but rather a fundamental need for stability and tranquility. Something they had not experienced for too long. This decision, however, brought with it new practical challenges. My current home, although comfortable for one adult and 2 part-time children, was insufficient for 3 permanent residents, especially considering that they were growing and needed more privacy. It was time to look for a more spacious house, a place where we could really settle down and start a new phase together. The story of my ex-wife's infidelity and its consequences had become a recurring topic of conversation among friends and coworkers. Many people criticized me for not having exposed her cheating publicly from the beginning. Some argued that I should have proclaimed the truth openly from the exact moment I discovered it. I understood their frustration perfectly, believe me. There were days when I wished I had done just that, but at the time I had chosen to focus on minimizing the emotional damage for Carl and Sia. I was processing my own broken heart and personal humiliation, and I had no desire to drag my children through a nasty public spectacle. When people insisted that I should have revealed the truth years ago, I patiently explained my perspective to them. My silence was not intended to protect my ex-wife at all. It was intended solely to protect my children. I wanted to shield them from the chaos as much as humanly possible. I was confident that the truth would eventually come out, and when it did, it would be on my own terms, in a way that minimized collateral damage for those I cared about most. Looking back on the situation, I still firmly stand by that decision. It's true that it allowed my ex to spread his distorted version for some time, but the alternative would have been much more damaging for Carl and Sia. By waiting for the right moment, I was able to expose the truth in an undeniable way, without turning it into a messy public spectacle that would have shamed my children even more deeply. With that weight finally off my conscience, I turned my full attention to the future. After approximately 2 months of exhaustive searching, I found the perfect home, a spacious, modern abode with enough room for each of us to enjoy our own personal space. Carl and Sia were genuinely thrilled when I showed them the property. Sia loved the possibility of finally having a bigger room that she could decorate to her taste, while Carl was particularly excited about the backyard, ideal for playing sports and especially for playing soccer. The move itself was chaotic, as all moves tend to be. But there was a general feeling of excitement and hope that made every moment of effort completely worthwhile. As we unpacked boxes and assembled furniture, I experienced a deep sense of pride. This represented our new beginning, a space where we could leave the painful past behind us once and for all and concentrate on building something much better for everyone. Of course, not everyone shared our joy at this significant change. My ex-wife reacted with fury when she found out that the children were moving in permanently with me. She even tried to manipulate them emotionally into coming back, calling them ungrateful and accusing them of abandoning her to her fate. But Carl and Sia stood firm in their decision. They explained that they needed to distance themselves temporarily, that they were exhausted from the constant drama and just wanted to concentrate on living a normal adolescence, without unnecessary tension. Listening to them defend themselves gave me mixed feelings. It pained me deeply to see how much they had had to mature prematurely because of this whole situation, but at the same time I felt immensely proud of their inner strength and emotional maturity. Carl took on a protective role, confronting my ex-wife directly. She could not prevail against our son's determination. As we settled into our new home, I made it a top priority to create an environment of normality for the children. I wanted them to feel completely safe and protected, to understand that this was a space where they could truly relax and express themselves freely. We established new family routines, shared dinners, board game nights and recreational outings on weekends. One night, while we were unpacking the last few boxes, Carl surprised me with an unexpected question. He asked me if I regretted not having publicly exposed his mother's infidelity much earlier. His question took me completely off guard, but I knew he deserved a totally honest answer. I explained that, although there were certainly times when I wished I had spoken up sooner, I did not regret it all the way I had handled the situation as a whole. Sia joined the conversation, saying that she was really glad he had waited for the right moment to reveal the truth to them. She confessed that it would probably have been too overwhelming for them to process when they were younger, but now the whole situation made more sense to her. Hearing those words from her gave me an immense feeling of validation. As if perhaps I hadn't made as many mistakes as I sometimes feared.